So before we begin, I kind of want to hear the audience reaction. What interests you into going to a panel about history when there's a bunch of fun panels out there, especially about shipping your favorite ponies together?
So simply enough, why are you here?
Yeah. All right.
My dad hosts a trivia game at Balticon every year.
Everyone's talking about Balticon. All right, actually, let's get a show of hands. Who here actually staffs or works for a convention? All right. Volunteering also counts. Who here is from Balticon? All right, we got some Balticon. Who here is from Otakon? All right. Anime USA. Katsucon. Just put your hands down.
Yeah, I've been around.
JohnCon.
That's embarrassing.
I know.
Sorry. It used to be awesome.
They wanted to do dinner with us. It'd be nice.
Oh, they are nice.
Furthermore.
Wait, well,
All right.
I kind of staffed.
Did you staff Furthermore?
Sorta.
Towson Anime Fest. Is that real? I'm just made that up. Shore Leave. Ah, we got some shore leaves. Awesome.
How about
4 points.
Oh.
Conclave. Awesome Con.
What is Conclave?
It's a Star Trek con. Baltimore Comic Con. All right. So we actually we have a good variety of people. Actually, who here did the Doctor Who Con Regeneration Who? All right, we have some more people.
The World Science Fiction Convention with the Hugo Awards.
It hasn't been hosted in Baltimore in the last decade.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
Amanda. Yeah, he knows.
Yep.
This year's being held in Missouri.
Okay.
Huh.
Oh yeah, who here is going to, was it Eye Contact Con, Opticon, supposed to be here in the Baltimore Convention next weekend? Do you guys see the signs? It's for an eyeglasses convention, I think. All right.
Okay, I'm swapping with him. I'm doing this wrong.
All right, you're doing it wrong.
I am. Tattoo convention.
Tattoo convention? All right.
They had a beer expo this past couple months ago.
Stop wasting time. We're already 2 minutes behind. All right, welcome to Baltimore. Is it Baltimore? Yeah. Well, welcome to the 5th anniversary of BronyCon. So this is a very special year, especially for the convention scene in Baltimore. So if you guys don't know, one of the oldest conventions in the city, Balticon, turns 50 years old this year. One of the youngest con, this very con, BronyCon, turns 5 years old. And this is the very last year that Otakon, the second largest anime con, will be held in this very convention center. So a very, very important year for Baltimore. But before we begin, since we're talking about conventions, I would like you guys to give a round of applause to all the hardworking staff in the back who helped put this together. All right. So we have one of my old panelists here is one of my former roommates. We're supposed to have another former roommate here, make a little old household reunion, but I guess he's still doing his job. That's what happens when you volunteer at cons.
I abandoned my job.
Yeah. So I'm going to introduce myself, and we're going to allow him to introduce himself. And then I'm going to start the first 15 minutes by going through a little brief history of what I found researching these different cons, working, staffing, doing stuff for different conventions. We're going to lead into about 20 minutes of discussions back and forth, and we're going to leave the last 15 to 20 minutes open for Q&As. Now, a little bit of background about myself. I am able to approach cons from an interesting perspective because there's kind of 3 parts of me that are drawn to cons. First, I'm an artist. I love art. I love creating stories. I love drawing. I also love the history, the evolution of artwork through the ages. And especially in the modern century, conventions are where a lot of the interplay between the professional art realm and the amateur art realm are kind of coalesce and start to mingle. I also studied psychology at Johns Hopkins University, which is just 3 miles north of the convention center. And from a psychological perspective, you could see what types of conventions attract a certain demographic of people and how that applies to kind of shifts in norms and culture. And the third part of me is I come from a military family. I went to military academy. I grew up in a very, very structured, organized environment where leadership, management, teamwork is very, very important. And looking at different cons, I see a lot of cons make it or break it, depending on how well the teams are run, especially since most of these con staffers are not paid. It's all volunteer. So how do you keep a group of volunteers happy if you don't know how to lead them? This is what we're going to talk about a bit. A little bit about me. I've been doing conventions for the last decade. I've staffed conventions. I've headed conventions. I've helped give, I guess, lessons? Yeah, advice to conventions. Design team was one of the stuff I've done. I've also been a vendor professionally. So for the last half decade, vending at conventions has been my sole income. I've also done panels. Panels like what I'm doing right now are something that I do at conventions. So I've kind of done almost everything you would expect. I've also been a community guest. In fact, I'll be a community guest at TrotCon next weekend, another pony convention in Ohio. So I've kind of done everything. I've been to most of the cons. I've seen a lot of the cons. So I kind of have an idea for how they work. And when I started to look at these cons specifically, I saw that a lot of these cons fall into different categories and genres, which we're going to discuss about. I'm going to allow my old roommate and good friend to introduce himself as he's pretending to write something down.
Is it working?
It is working now, I think.
Excellent. Alrighty. Well, my name is Brandon Hess. My handle online is Fire Envy. I just graduated college, actually, after changing my majors. Before I was in the convention scene, before I was in the convention scene, I was actually in engineering, and I was starting to look at maybe business. But after working with conventions for, oh God, how long now?
About the same time I started doing PonyCons, I think.
Yeah, it's about 5 years-ish now, I guess. After going to them, after working them, I realized that my passion is event management, hospitality management, that I really enjoy this side of things. Seeing a product like this come together, it just brings me, I don't know, immense joy I can't find anywhere else. And I've taken that passion and I've attended, I've staffed, I've vended, I've worked with people in other conventions. I've staffed EQLA a couple times. I founded CloudCon, worked at Otakon for several years now, Anime USA, Big Apple PonyCon the first year.
He was my booth helper at TrotCon.
Yeah, I helped vend at TrotCon, and furthermore,
I paid for his hotel.
he didn't pay me else. Okay, I've attended TrotCon, furthermore, Anthrocon, Las Pegasus, Unicom. Sorry, I shouldn't mention that out loud.
Oh, we're going to mention that.
Oh, please, let's talk about it. It was so much fun. I ran out of list.
I think one thing you're going to notice is we actually do a lot of the same cons, and but we're going to have very different opinions about conventions, and we've spent long nights just talking about our different theories on how cons are run. And I think it will give you a wide variety. That's why I wanted him on this panel, because it'll give you a wide variety of different perspectives on conventions. But
talking about it, saying talking is kind of polite. We were very heated arguments sometimes.
All right, just a shameless plug. This is my booth. If you want to talk to me about conventions afterwards, this is where you could chat with me. And this is a panel. If you like learning about fandoms, if you like learning about the evolution of art and history, this is the panel that you might want to check out. This is one of the favorite panels. I do it at Balticon, at Otakon. I do it at most cons I go to. It's called The Great Literary Game, or Transformative Art. I'll be doing it 2 nights, I think, in the Star Room, so right next door at midnight. So if you want to check that out, feel free ahead.
I won't be there.
All right. So these are some of the cons that have graced the Baltimore and DC area in the last half century. There's been a wide variety of cons. People who work in this area kind of know there are 4 major locations where Baltimore and DC likes to hold cons. Baltimore Convention Center, the Hunt Valley Inn, National Harbor, and the DC Convention Center are really the 4 go-to cons. In fact, most cons you see are going to be in one of those 4, except for some which might be in Bethesda, I think, Small Press Expo.
Bethesda North.
And you tried to put CloudCon there as well, right?
Yeah, Bethesda North is pretty interesting.
Right. All right, so let's give a little rundown about the history of conventions. What's kind of interesting is a lot of people could make up the ideas and say this is where we could trace something. I will say if you want to look at the history of cons, there's really no academic literature. There's actually no peer-reviewed research. So when I kind of came into the field looking at these different conventions, I realized I was the first kind of categorize the different timelines and eras most of these cons fall into. Most people who write about the history of their con only write about it for that specific genre. So you might see some essays on furry cons or sci-fi cons, but you never see one that kind of looks at all these conventions in general. And you could really trace the first cons to fan gatherings around the fireplace with cavemen and shamans telling stories, but if you really want to look at a more accurate representation, I would say when Jane Austen novels came out in the Victorian era, that was when novels were written to a middle-class audience. A middle-class audience would say, hey, stories used to be written about upper-class audiences. Now we middle-class people are important because they're writing stories about us. So they'll form these little literary circles and they'll talk about how important the middle class was. And you could say this is where the origins of like literary book clubs kind of came about. You could kind of fast forward and say by the time the Victorian era and the Edwardian era were at its height, that's when Sherlock Holmes came out. And that's when you kind of got the more modern take on fandoms. You will have people drawing Sherlock Holmes fan art, you'll see people writing Sherlock Holmes stories, you'll see people kind of partaking in this. Fast forward a little bit more, and you'll see people join mailing lists. And people will mail to other fans back and forth talking about their favorite types of convention. It wasn't until the 1930s when the first modern conception of cons started with science fiction meetups. Now, science fiction meetups in the 1930s would normally involve a bunch of people, probably like 100 attendees, going to a hotel for a weekend because one of their favorite authors are there. So science fiction conventions started with one author, which was the original guest of honor, and a lot of panels kind of planned around the author. And I think we discussed earlier, WorldCon is the first science fiction convention, it's the oldest science fiction convention, and you can kind of see the model for WorldCon affecting every single other type of con down the line. Now, this has been kind of the model for conventions up until the 60s when Star Trek comes around. Now, when people when in the media and pop culture, when people make fun of conventions, the type of cons they like to portray are Trekkie cons.
Trekker.
Yeah, if you think about it, you have the original cosplayers there.
Yep.
You had like the modern concept of having a guest of honor come, more than one guest of honor, because sci-fi conventions used to be based around one community guest. Now it's multiple guests of honors, normally from the show. You start having panels, you get the early inception of vendors halls there. There was no artist alley back then, but you had early vendor halls, and you kind of had the modern idea of conventions. I'm rarely going to talk about fandom conventions, but I'm going to talk about BronyCons and Star Trek cons, because those are the two franchises that actually had an impact on how cons were run within the United States. Now, fast forward a little bit more, and you're going to get a new type of con. So you have one tree where you have Star Trek cons and sci-fi cons. Then you're going to have a new type of tree, which are the Comic Cons. Comic Cons kind of started as one-day events where a bunch of local comic book shops would take their old bins of comics and just sell them to people. That's where you got the original San Diego Comic Con. Comic Con introduced now a new factor into the convention scene. They introduced something called the Artist Alley, because a lot of the guests they will invite to these conventions were industry artists in the comic book industry, and they would like to sign books, but sometimes they would like to draw. So they will draw for fans, and they will do commissions for fans. So the early idea of artist alleys emerged with these early Comic Cons. Now, all the way in Japan, you now have another type of convention developing. These were conventions based around the fans. Now, in America, up to this point, most of the cons were based around the professional industries, fans uniting around professional industry. So Star Trek cons, sci-fi cons would have someone who works in the profession as a guest of honor. Comic cons would be inviting people from the comic book industry. But in Japan, you now have a rise of people drawing Dundinshi, which you could say extended from Tijuana Bibles in America, but Dundinshi were little fan-made comics. And you see a lot of these gatherings of people drawing their own fan works based around a copyrighted franchise, but Japan, despite being very, very strict on protecting their IP, trademarks, and copyrights, kind of turned a blind eye and allowed artists to draw their own little fan-made comics, fan-made prints and stuff. And you'll start to see a lot of anime cons kind of pop up. with just halls and halls of people just drawing fan art. So if we think about the largest convention of any type, fan convention of any type in the world, is Comic-Con. Comic-Con is 3 times larger than San Diego Comic-Con. And while San Diego Comic-Con is filled with industry people, Comic-Con is basically all fan artists, all dungeon artists. And Comic-Con is held twice a year. So you actually now have 2 different conceptions of artist alleys being developed. You have a professional artist alley with people within the professional industry, and you have a fan-made artist alley. So these are like going to be the 3 bases you're going to see future cons emerge from: Comic Cons, Anime Cons, and Sci-Fi Cons. Now let's fast forward a little bit more, and you're going to start to see a merging with new media coming up. One of the interesting break-off from sci-fi cons we have are furry cons. Now, what's interesting about the furry fandom is furries, if you think about it, anthropomorphic animals, should be something that is a cultural norm. If you think about every single culture, they have had half human, half beast-like creatures. They have had gods that were half animals. We grew up with cereal mascots, sports team mascots, with Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny, so you would think that
Disney.
you would think that furries would be the most normative thing within the community. But for some reason, they seem to be, when you think of fandoms, you think of them as the most enclosed and isolated of all the fandoms. Now, it's interesting because there is a story behind that. Let's start to the first type of furry cons. The furry cons got their origins from room parties at sci-fi cons. In fact, sci-fi cons are what popularized the room parties. And if you still want to go to some of the best room parties of any convention, go to a science fiction convention. They have awesome organized room parties. So one thing that sci-fi cons have that most other cons don't have is they have the bulletin board in the lobby where people could post-it notes and flashcards, advertising room parties at a specific date, specific time. And if you think about, furry cons kind of evolved from that. Room parties for people who like anthropomorphic animals. There was really no term for furries back then. But then you got a bunch of room parties for people who like animals, and they would gather together and say, why don't we just start our own convention? And that's when you started getting in the first furry conventions. So in the 90s, you're going to see an influx of furry conventions. Some of the first furry cons that were organized actually kind of fell to the wayside. It wasn't until the late 90s when Uncle Kage kind of stepped in and became the contra of AnthroCon that you started seeing furry cons become the way they are. Now, furry cons now have a different branch from this timeline because furry cons, the most important thing they would have to battle are negative perceptions in the media. While the media will make fun of Trekkies and otaku and comic fans as being, man-children who live in their mother's basements and stuff, it was fair to say that furries got the worst of the media portrayal. So to try to prevent press from infesting the convention floor and just sensationalizing furry conventions, Uncle Kage was kind of put a stop to all press coming into cons. And since AnthroCon is the largest and most influential of the furry cons, you're going to see a lot of furry cons mirroring this format. So they're going to be kind of more restrictive to press. They're going to be more isolated. They really want only furries to come, while things like Comic Cons and Anime Cons want to have people who are even not fans come in to kind of learn what's going on. Furry cons want to kind of enclose themselves and say, no, only if you're fans of this, we kind of want you here. We don't need any more drama. So you're going to start seeing furry cons isolate themselves, which could be a good or bad thing. You could say what Uncle Kage did was good because it helped prevent any more negative perceptions of furries in the media.
And it also kept the focus of the convention on the attendees themselves rather than on,
pleasing the press.
Exactly.
But could also be a bad thing because even in the modern day, if you look at the evolution of conventions, you could see furry cons are still probably half a decade behind in terms of speeding up the process for getting badges, lines, stuff that a lot of cons have adapted post I would say Anime Expo getting big. They have adapted a lot of these formats, and furry cons have kind of isolated themselves and still have an old school science fiction model, which is good. It works for science fiction cons, but it doesn't really work as well for furry cons, especially I think the Artist Alley, is a big example of what furry cons lack in behind. But we're not here to talk about that.
No.
we are going to then move forward. So then we're going to have things like multimedia and gaming conventions. These are going to be big. Now, it's going to be an interesting overlap with trade shows because this is where you see trade shows. You have people advertising new cars, new electronics, video games. Kind of started with trade shows, which then I think after Penny Arcade did PAX, that kind of made like gaming cons, which were normally for press and industry, more accessible to the public. And you would see like a new type of convention. And then this is now when we get to, I think, 2004, 2005, 2006, when right before Iron Man comes out, you're going to start seeing Comic Cons kind of dwindling a bit. And all of a sudden, Marvel comes out with Iron Man, DC comes out with Dark Knight, and all of a sudden there's a re-energized popularity in superheroes, but not through the comic book industry, it's through the film industry. So you're going to see Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, the biggest comic convention, now start inviting people who are not in the comic book industry, but as a showcase for their films and movies. You're going to see television stars, you're going to see film stars there. So at this point, Comic-Con stops becoming a purely comic convention and now becomes an all-media convention. And you're going to see this creates a new type of convention, which we're going to talk about a little bit soon. All right, so that's kind of just a little evolutionary trap up to Brony conventions, which I'll save for later. But you could see each of these type of cons pick up something that's unique from the other. So you have the idea of a guest of honor and gathering of fans from sci-fi cons. You're going to see the idea of artist alleys from separately from both anime cons and comic cons, which are going to collide in the late 2000s, which are going to become a big issue, especially for people who run vendor halls and artist alleys and people who vend at them. So what's interesting is anime cons are open about using fan characters and drawing prints and keychains and whatever based off fan characters, while Comic-Con's artist alleys are more for people who work in the professional industry and try to create and pitch their own original stuff. And I think it's very, very telling because just a few weeks ago at AwesomeCon down in DC, there were some professionals in the artist alleys, people who actually work on comic books, complaining that they don't like being by the print vendors, as they called, or people who sold wares. They would say, these people do not belong to the artist alley. Let's occupy artist alley and take it back for the actual artist. So it's interesting, once cons became more multimedia, two separate types of artist alleys start merging. You start seeing comic cons now adapting anime con style artist alleys. And that has become an issue for people who actually work in the comic book industry. Whether that causes an effect later on, we don't know now because it's just started coming into the fray. But you're going to see that affecting other things. Now let's kind of look at what else affects other things. So we go to furry cons. Furry cons have an interesting structure for doing things. And then we come to BronyCons. So what's interesting about My Little Pony conventions are, unlike other cons, you could see a natural evolution. So I studied genetics and biology at Johns Hopkins, so I look at things like an evolutionary tree. You could kind of see a historical trend for how anime cons, furry cons, and sci-fi cons all connect. BronyCons, the first BronyCon really got their start from meetups because that's where bronies started meeting each other, were meetups. So the very, very first BronyCon in New York started by Purple Tinker. I'm not sure if she is here, but she started the very first Brony convention. It was based off a meetup. She never had con experience before. She didn't know how to run a con. She thought, hey, I'll just book a hotel for a day or two and have a bunch of people there. Well, it got very crowded, fire marshal got called in, and it was obvious that you cannot run a convention like you run a meetup. So all of a sudden, you start seeing a bunch of BronyCons pop across the country, and each of them, because the original BronyCon was kind of not firm in its structure, each of these cons would have to latch on to a pre-existing con in their area to get their start. So for example, in Seattle, Everfree Northwest, the I think second or third largest Brony convention, always ties with BabsCon, got their start by teaming up with Further Fiesta. Not Rainforest, that's it, the furry con there. Yeah. So you're going to see the format of I guess, Everfree based off of FurryCon, while in San Francisco, BabsCon got a lot of help from the local Star Trek and science fiction conventions. And you can see the format of BabsCon based around science fiction con. So for example, art shows and, like I said, the bulletin board and the lobby are two staples of science fiction cons. BabsCon, up until this year, was the only con in the fandom that had an art show, and also still the only con that has the bulletin board in the lobby. You can see that traced back to its roots. In fact, if you look at any PonyCon fandom, you could see which roots it gets traced back from. Nightmare Nights in Dallas, where I now live, is based around furry cons because the two people who run it, Chef Sandy and Bob Carr, worked for furry cons for over 2 decades. So you can see the format of how they lay out their vendor hall very, very similar to how they lay out vendor halls in furry cons. While TrotCon in Ohio is run by Darkly, who staffed at anime cons for a long time. You can see it based off the format of a lot of anime cons. BronyCon is interesting because it's been around for 5 years, but it doesn't really have a solid structure, and it was only really when BronyCon moved to the Baltimore Convention Center and some Oldacon staff slowly started moving into the staff here that we started seeing BronyCon slowly adapting the format of, I think, what Oldacon would be. But you could also say BronyCon is still unique in its way. Like, for example, let's talk about your art show, for example. What's interesting is almost any innovation that happens in Brony convention scene, you could see it traced back to, like I said, another convention. I've been suggesting an art show to him for a while now, and he finally got an art show started this year, which I'm glad. Yep. But there are 2 types of art shows in the convention community. You have furry con art shows, and you have anime con art shows. He created an art show that is completely just pulled out of his rear end because there is no format.
You.
So let me
AnimeCon.
Okay, let me tell you why I think it's interesting that you created a new type of art show, because furry cons, there's normally no fee for registering art. Most art there is to showcase an artist. If you want to do a silent auction, they will take a percentage, normally 10% off the thing. So that's kind of how furry cons work. Anime cons, you don't pay by item, you pay by panel or slot, and you could fill each panel or slot with up to 6 to 10 pieces. He did an interesting thing where it's a $5 fee, I think, for each item, which I don't think has been attempted in any fandom convention before, where it's a per entry fee. But that's also, it could be good or bad because it's more geared to people who want to do silent auction off their art. But it's not geared towards people who want to showcase their art like a FurryCon might. Because a lot of people want to showcase their art just to get their name out there. And I think...
Well, see, with that, I looked at what he just described, at the 2 different types of art shows, and I realized that neither of them were going to satisfy the needs of what I was looking for. We were looking for something that could really give an option for those artists that really just can't afford an artist alley table. So paying $25 to $50 for an entire panel to post a bunch of art, well, that may not be an option.
But would you say
if they couldn't afford the $85 table in the first place.
Like looking at the art show just recently, it's like 1 art piece per panel.
I will say, one of the things we actually did, instead of pulling something from a convention, we actually stole something right from PayPal. Or I'm sorry, eBay, the buy it now option. Unfortunately, people have been doing that.
Buy it now has been at every single con. Okay, fine. All right, so here's actually something interesting. So actually, I don't think any mutual friends we know are here. I think we could let everyone in on a little sneaky secret. We both ran for cons here for BronyCon last year. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to be con chair. I didn't want BronyCon. I just didn't want to. He had some ideas that he wanted to suggest, but he was afraid that people wouldn't listen to them. So he had me kind of submit his ideas under my name. So I basically became the bad guy by submitting some ideas that he thought were too innovative, and he tried to play himself off as the good guy. But what was interesting was I was like, I'll run for con chair. I'm obviously going to win, but I wanted to see how the election process works for a nonprofit convention, which was pretty interesting. But it was an excuse for me to actually, because I've been working on a book about fan conventions for about almost half a decade now. So I was like, it'll be a good excuse to put together some of the research I've gathered into a platform. And I think one of the interesting things I put together were the attendance averages for different convention types around the nation. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something that, as far as I know, has never really been done, especially for this area, but it's never been done on a nation scale.
Yeah. So, like I was mentioning earlier, there are very different types of cons, and I will rank them from the largest to the smallest. So the largest types of cons, we're going to see about 100,000 attendees are going to be multimedia conventions. So these are going to be cons that represent more than one type of industry. So San Diego Comic-Con and New York Comic-Con, even though comic is in its name, there are now conventions for novels, for television shows, for movies. So these are multimedia conventions. You're going to see them on average have at least 100,000 attendees. The next type of con you're going to see are in the tens of thousands. These are going to be industry or genre specific conventions. So these are going to be cons that are purely comic cons or purely anime cons. So Otacon's a good example. Normally you're going to see comic cons larger than anime cons, but they normally switch back and forth. Normally, Comic Cons are larger than anime cons. Now, the next step down you're going to see are cons that are based around a genre. So you're going to have horror cons, you're going to have sci-fi cons, you're going to have fantasy cons. So these are cons based around a specific genre. And you're going to see more in the 5,000 range for these types of conventions. So you notice each time the numbers have a bit. Then when you go down a bit more, you're going to see cons based around one section of a genre. So for example, if you consider comics as a genre, you can say indie comics are a subsection of that genre. And these are going to be your like small press expos and stuff. So one step down again, you're going to have franchise cons. You're going to have cons based around a specific franchise. So these are going to be Star Trek cons, Doctor Who cons, Harry Potter cons. Next step down, you're going to see generation of a franchise. So these are cons that don't represent the entire franchise, but one sliver of a franchise. So for example, next generation of Star Trek would be a sliver of a franchise, or My Little Pony conventions, because we don't represent all of My Little Pony, we only represent the fourth generation.
Typically.
Then the smallest type of con you're going to see are the fur cons. And fur cons are going to be the absolute smallest because they aren't based around any franchise, they're based around a community of people. And you're going to see fur cons fluctuate between a few hundred to probably about 4,000. And then the very, very smallest types of cons you're going to see are kind of university cons, which I added just for a list, but they aren't going to be really necessary. Now, what's interesting is if you look at any area around the country and look at these different types of cons, each of these cons fall into a predictable average. So I use Baltimore and DC for an example, and if we look at the multimedia cons, AwesomeCon falls exactly where you expect a multimedia con for. If you look at industry cons, Otakon, MagFest, and Baltimore Comic-Con fall exactly within those exact numbers. If you look at genre cons, Balticon falls perfectly there. Shore Leave is going to be perfect for franchise cons. Furthermore is going to be perfect for furry cons. Cloudsville Congress, which was founded by this man, is going to fall perfectly for sliver of a franchise cons or BronyCons. And the very, very smallest, you're going to see John Con, which is a university con. Now, which con on this list does not belong? Look at BronyCon, right there. Yes. Look at BronyCon. BronyCon does not fall anywhere near close to its average. In fact, the average for My Little Pony cons, I would say, is 500 to 3,000 at its max. And in fact, after BronyCon, the next two largest cons, which normally tie for second place, are BabsCon and Everfree. Everfree and BabsCon combined and doubled do not even have the same numbers of BronyCons. So what's going on here? How is BronyCon shooting upwards to where you would see industry cons taking place?
I don't know, Alex. How are they?
God damn it. So what do we know about BronyCon? We're going to talk about Unicon later, but people always say, we don't want BronyCon to become a Unicon. Well, the truth is, BronyCon could Unicon every year, but we'll never know. Because here's the important thing. BronyCon has name recognition. That's the one thing Purple Tinker started with BronyCon that was important. She trademarked and copyrighted the name BronyCon. And in fact, BronyCon has become a colloquial term for pony conventions around this country. When I went to Seattle to go to Everfree Northwest, when I talked to the locals about the convention, they didn't tell me, oh, are you vending at Everfree Northwest? They said, oh, are you vending at the Seattle Pony Convention or BronyCon? When I was in San Francisco and was staffing BabsCon, they didn't say, oh, you're going to BabsCon. They said, San Francisco BronyCon. So BronyCon has now become the colloquial word for conventions around the country, yet only one con in the fandom now holds rights to the name BronyCon. And what's very, very interesting about this is we are a very interesting fandom. We do not have, unlike Star Trek fandom, for example, which kind of has a unofficial blessing from the creators and staff and everything like that. We really do not have any official word or blessing from Hasbro. We might from show staff, but not from Hasbro specifically. In fact, Hasbro has no official liaisons or conduits to our fandom. The only unofficial agent that is between the entire Brony fandom and the entire Hasbro sphere is one tiny little point, BronyCon. Because to be honest, Hasbro is not going to pay attention to Everfree Northwest. They're not going to pay attention to Babscon. Even though these are the second largest cons in the fandom, they're going to pay attention to one convention. In fact, the nation is going to only pay attention to one convention. When people want to report on bronies, they don't report of the small local cons like TrotCon or Nightmare Nights. Are going to report about BronyCon. So BronyCon is not only the face of the fandom to Hasbro, it is the face of the fandom to the entire world. And while you might hear, oh, all these cons are kind of going back and forth and have little internal fightings and war for each other, it's mostly playful and on the surface. Because the truth is, BronyCon is kind of like an unofficial con that's not owned by anyone. It's a con that represents the fandom and the community, and if that falls, it doesn't matter if Babscon's successful, it doesn't matter if Everfree is successful. BronyCon is the one con that I said is the intermediary between them. So if something bad happens for BronyCon, everyone around the country, all the fans are going to try to help prevent it from burning up and catching on fire from behind the scenes. And you definitely see this. In fact, BronyCon might be it's successful now, but if you look at the first at least 3 to 4 years, it's been one of the most chaotic cons. I dare say it's even more chaotic than Unicons with the consistent mess ups that have been. Con chairs have been replacing con chairs. People have been
Department heads
cycled.
Yeah.
Even complete departments just completely annihilated outwards. But because of the unity between the fandom, it has to remain. Doesn't matter how bad BronyCon is behind the scenes. It has to survive. So people say, well, if BronyCon is kind of working with this structure, what does it add to the con scene? Well, I would say one thing that's interesting that BronyCon in general have added to the convention sphere are the idea of VIPR or VIP relations. Now, Purple Tinker, who was the founder of BronyCon, I don't think she was as experienced as she claims to be in creating the convention, but she had some interesting insights about how she wanted to run her original BronyCon. And she kind of liked to compare BronyCon as an intermediary between furry cons and Star Trek cons, and I kind of took her theory and ran with it. So for Star Trek cons, you have a wide generation of shows and movies to work from. Star Trek has been around for 50 years. You could grab any background actor from who only appeared in one episode and have them as a guest of honor, and it will be fine. It doesn't matter if there's 100 Star Trek cons around the country. You could find any type of guest that will attract people, and it will be perfect. Furry cons don't have any franchises to pull from, so they pull from their core community, the group of fan artists. BronyCon fall into an interesting category where we have a very, very select pool of people to pull from. We do not have Gen 1, Gen 2, or Gen 3 to work from. We only have Gen 4 to work from. And there are only 6 main characters in the show, and there's only 5 voice actresses who works with these main characters, and there's only 3 voice actresses who are free, because one of them is a full-time musician, the other one is just insanely high to afford. So you're going to have only 3 main voice actresses as potential guests of honor for your con, and you're going to have 90 pony conventions around the country trying to get these VAs. So unlike Star Trek cons, where you can almost pull from anywhere and have a solid con, you have a very, very limited pool to work from. And not only that, let's say your con gets Tara Strong, for example. What happens if you do something that makes her time at the convention miserable? She's not going to think about, oh, this one con annoyed me. She's going to think pony cons in general are a mess. And since they all work together, what happens if Tara Strong had a bad time at one con? She's going to go in to the studio one day and talk to Ashley Ball and says, hey, I don't think we should do these cons anymore. They're just a lot of trouble. They're going to listen, and then the other show staff are going to listen, and all of a sudden, we lose our potential pool of guests of honor to pull from. So who are you going to invite to these cons to draw people in? Are you going to pool, are the pools going to be vendors? Well, you could see vendors at almost every other con. Are they going to be the YouTube commentators or the musicians? Well, almost every con are going to have them. So Brony conventions have a very, very scary thing to work from. Anime cons, Comic cons, Star Trek cons, sci-fi cons, they don't really care if their guests are miserable or not. In fact, I think Otakon has had some bad horror stories where some musicians and VAs come all the way from Japan, have a miserable time, and just don't want to go again. And Otakon says, whatever, we have 30,000 attendees and we could pull from almost anyone. So cons that size don't really care if they lose a potential guest. BronyCons, if one con loses a potential guest, we all lose a potential guest. And in fact, there's been a period for almost 2 years where Tara Strong and Ashley Ball, and I think John Delancey didn't do any My Little Pony conventions. So because of this, we had to keep our guests happy. The second con chair of BronyCon realized this issue, and I don't think he's a smart person. He's done some bad stuff with businesses, stole some money, and I don't know why he's working for.
No comment.
I'm not sure why he's working for business for BabsCon. But anyways, he decided, the one smart thing I would say is he did create VIP relations to make sure these guests of honors are happy. Because if these guests are happy, they're going to want to come to the cons. In fact, nowadays we have staff say, can you please invite me to your con again? I had a lot of fun drinking with you guys. They want to come to these cons. We have to keep them happy. And in fact, after BronyCons started having VIPR, almost every single con started adapting VIPR. You start seeing anime conventions modeling their VIP department based off how BronyCons have their VIP departments. And that's an interesting side effect that BronyCons had in the fandom. Unicon, for example, was the one con that we could use as a demarcation line between the evolution of not just pony conventions, but cons in general. Because when Unicon happened, there was an influx of cons happening around the country. There was, I think, over 90 My Little Pony conventions happening in the United States alone at the time Unicon took place. And when Unicon fell, that was a wake-up call for the entire community. Not just the My Little Pony community, but for every single convention around the world. You saw anime cons, comic cons, sci-fi cons, Star Trek cons, all of a sudden having emergency meetings to say, we don't want to be like this My Little Pony convention. We cannot fail like they do. And you saw a lot of cons reinvent themselves and restructure themselves to prevent another Unicon from happening. Yeah. And you could say Unicon is a good and bad thing for the Brony convention scene. Yeah. So on one hand, it's a good thing because now we are more wiser to prevent something like this from happening. On the other hand, it's a bad thing because we set our bar so low, we could say, as long as we didn't Unicon, we're fine. We didn't make money, we didn't Unicon, we're fine. And so that becomes an interesting thing as well. Yes, you had a question. Well, Unicon, also known as Las Pegasus Unicon, was a convention that was held in Las Vegas. It was a My Little Pony convention. One of the worst run. It was run by people who were known scam artists who actually operated in a mob hotel and suspiciously disappeared. We assumed since they operated in a mob hotel to bury them in the Mojave Deserts and they couldn't pay off the mobs. But they invited John Delancey, they invited Tara Strong, they invited like the big names in the fandom.
I think they had 29 voice actors.
And they couldn't pay for them. By Friday night, the rooms, they were being kicked out of their rooms. Attendees who paid expensive money for con suite rooms were kicked out of their rooms. The vendors and artists had no money because you couldn't exchange monies. And in fact, that's the one thing I would say Otakon is still at fault of because Otakon still uses a system where it's receipts instead of physical money. Yeah. Unicon had a system of actually...
Unicon bucks?
Unicon bucks. It was fake paper money that you would give the artist and the artist would exchange it for money. Well, that was gone. All the agents who were collecting money for autographs all of a sudden found their safes of money stolen.
And empty, if they weren't stolen.
It was a unifying event in the fandom because you had people who hated each other, who worked together. You had Everfree Network, Derpy News, Equestria Daily, BronyCon, BabsCon, like a lot of these different groups who initially did not like each other all come together and help raise money to make sure John Delancey and Tara Strong got their hotel rooms paid and their flights paid for, that the attendees were able to at least stay the night, and some of the vendors were at least comped. So it was a good thing, a unifying thing in the fandom. It was also kind of bad, like I said, it kind of did set the bar a bit low.
It also did add something that I think became very important, return flights as part of contracts.
Yeah, return flights, very important. All right. So these things I don't really need to talk about. If you guys have questions, I will refer to some of the interesting topics that we might have. But that kind of gives you an overview for how these conventions work. And you could say after BronyCon, what's the next natural evolution of cons? I would say it's the Western animation cons, which you could see automatically copy the style of BronyCons. They have VIPR. They have a very, very similar vendor horror artist alley structured off pony conventions. They have a very similar way for how they announce community guests and stuff. So there is a natural evolution for how what BronyCons had as an impact within the convention scene, and now Western animation cons are new cons. And it is interesting because BronyCons are now up there with Star Trek cons. Despite not being as large of a fandom as probably Doctor Who or Twilight or Harry Potter, how many Twilight cons or Harry Potter cons do you see nowadays?
Yeah.
0. How many Doctor Who cons until recently have you seen?
There's LeakyCon.
Well, but they had to reform. They're no longer a Harry Potter con. They're now a new multimedia type convention. See, to survive, these cons could not, they had to expand out of the current sphere of influence. That's why I was worried. I think actually in the Conjure platform, I was predicting BronyCons to fall to the wayside in the same way as Doctor Who and Harry Potter cons have, but they haven't, which is a good thing. But that was one of my big fears. I was saying BronyCons couldn't survive just being based off one sliver of a franchise, but they obviously have. But I was saying the next natural evolution, I predicted the next natural evolution would be to expand to Western animation in general. So like Steven Universe and Gravity Falls and Adventure Time and stuff. And my predictions came true because you had cons like DerbyCon and DrawnCon, which are now Western animation cons coming into that same sphere. You had a Twilight Con that held once, never happened again. Now you start seeing new Doctor Who cons. But for a fandom that's been around for longer than Star Trek, you will expect to see Doctor Who conventions in the United States as crazy as they are, as Star Trek cons are. No, there was only one Gallifrey run for the longest time until recently. So when it comes to individual fandoms who had an impact in the convention scene, I would say it's Star Trek cons and pony cons who had the largest sphere of influence, I would say.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so that's kind of like the overview, and we definitely want to take some question and answers. If you have any questions, please line up at the microphone. If you guys don't have questions, we'll continue talking about some of the other interesting things that we have. And again, I have another panel tonight. Panel's not over though, but if you guys want questions, feel free to talk. And before we take questions, since I kind of droned on long enough, I'm going to have Brandon here kind of give a few words on what he might want to talk about. So any feedback you have to what I had to say?
Well, I've had a chance to work with a lot of conventions just due to the fact that I work with BronyCon, and I was in Baltimore, and we were right next to Otakon.
Yeah.
I had a unique opportunity to, in 2013, to attend something called the Convention Exchange that Otakon had just started that year. And I actually had a chance to meet with the heads of anime conventions all across the country, as well as a few other types of local conventions. I think DerbyCon was actually there. That was their first year. Maybe. It might have been the second
I have some
one.
interesting stories about that.
Yeah, but
Actually, that's an interesting thing because BronyCon used to do a luncheon for the different con organizers. And
well, we had less time this year. to
I know,
plan
but
stuff.
let me say an interesting thing. From the perspective of a psychology major who also, did military academy, one thing I had to learn in military school is read people well and see who were good leadership type and who were actually bad at managing leadership. So I think the first convention luncheon we had was 2013 or 2014.
2014.
It's one of those. Anyways, I walked in and I could automatically identify
Who was the anime
who
person?
ran professional conventions like anime and Comic Cons and who were brand new My Little Pony conventions who had no idea what they were talking about. I'm not going to name names, but the people who were running My Little Pony Cons obviously did not know what they were getting themselves into, and they're all giddy and excited. And then you see the anime con and Comic Con people just like, stop talking to me. We are serious big boys here. And in fact, I think Shore Leave, actually, when I was talking to folks from Shore Leave, they were kind of poking fun at BronyCon when we first moved down here, saying, "Oh, the new kids on the block, huh?"
Yeah.
But Shore Leave also pokes fun, I think, at Creative Con, calling them, pro cons, or professional cons.
See, it's funny you mention that because that was the exact same experience I had walking into the convention exchange with Otakon. I could tell that there was this massive gap between the large anime conventions and then the new anime conventions. A lot of the smaller ones, the older ones, they handled themselves much like the large ones. You could actually tell that it wasn't as easy to tell by size, but by age. A lot of the newer ones were just walking up to everyone excited, going, "Hey, yeah, we had this problem with registration. That was the craziest thing. I thought everybody was going to die." And you could see them rolling their eyes and said, "Have you ever had a guest of honor get high, get naked, and threaten to jump off a pedestrian bridge while also being 2 hours late to their panel? Yeah, no, calm down. Sit down, Sparky." And it was just, I can't say which convention or who told me or what year or what guest, but it was true.
Yeah.
Oh, no, not my story to tell.
Well, what's interesting is, like I said, we kind of have two different takes on conventions, even though we basically either ran or attended the same conventions. But I will admit, I am wrong at times as well, and he's sometimes right. I'll admit you're wrong most of the time. Actually,
he's willing to
one
admit
of the
that, of course.
predictions I actually had was, because one of the things about most of the new My Little Pony conventions are found with people with no con experience, and I was saying that was a big no-no. The most successful My Little Pony conventions, I would say, are TrotCon in Columbus and Nightmare Nights in Dallas, and that's because the con chairs and founders ran anime and furry cons for at least 10 years beforehand. And you could see that they were still stable and surviving because of that, not name recognition, but because of how good they run their convention. And I would say in the Brony community, the best people you should have to run cons are probably former military. That's a little bit of bias for me, but because I think when you are in the military, you do have a certain code of conduct to abide to. You have to learn team building. You have to know organization, management, structure, and stuff. So I was predicting the best run cons in the Brony community should be run by current and former military Bronies. And I even said that you were driving me to the airport to Pacific PonyCon, and I said, we need to have a con that's run by all military Bronies. I go to Pacific PonyCon, and it was a good con, but there was a lot of mistakes that were being made. I was like, oh my god, this is another typical Brony convention with newbies who didn't know what they're doing. And then I realized the con chair, every single department except for one, was run by a former military person. It's like, oh, well, I guess my theory was not completely correct. So, vendors. And the guy who ran vendors, I would say, he's a good friend, and I would say he actually did a good job. But I would say do not have your attendees print out an application form, write it in with a pen, then scan it in. That's not the best way to do it. All right, I think, sorry, we talked on a little too long. We have 10 minutes left for a panel, so I'm going to try to take the questions really fast. I think one question per minute, I think will be good. So, fire away.
Hi, you mentioned earlier that...
Is it on?
We're good.
Hello?
Okay, there we go.
There we go. You mentioned earlier that Hasbro takes a very hands-off approach to the conventions. If they did get involved with the conventions, what kind of effects do you think that would have? And would that be good for the convention, and would it be good for Hasbro?
Okay, let me answer first, and then I'll let you. I'll just say a good example is My Little Pony Fair. That's what would happen if Hasbro has a hands-on, and he has something else to say.
Yeah. So officially, Hasbro has never been to BronyCon. I know in 2012 and 2013, we actually formally sent them letters, like typed out and snail mail letters saying, if you come, you get a booth. You get massive booth free. Please come. And we're so glad that they said no. But they didn't say no. They never said anything. Officially, they never came to us ever. Unofficially, they've been at every single BronyCon. They're probably downstairs. Well, the hall's closed. They were down there today. I can almost guarantee you. My buddy.
They're very bad disguising themselves. You could tell who the IP lawyers are who work for these companies.
Pretty much. And that's the thing. If Hasbro were to come, he said it would be very similar to MLP Fair, but you would basically see almost everything that we know and we treasure about the vendor halls of all of these conventions. We would see them basically disappear. Things like those plushies, gone. Hats, probably.
You're just copying what I just told you 2 days ago.
False.
Just joking. But no, I actually, that was one of the discussions we had with each other. I was we were mentioning that Hasbro BronyCons have these interesting blind eye because our vendor halls are filled with basically 99% people who make fan art of properties that they did not own. What would happen if Hasbro did step in? The vendor halls will only be filled with We Love Fun and Interplay. Would you like to go to a con with just 2 booths? That's basically it. Or resellers.
And also the comic book artists. So we
That's
have
it.
7 people.
You have 7 people at the con.
Fantastic.
Yes.
It'd be the best. It'd be awful.
All right, next question.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering if, like, let's just say the community, and I don't want to use the word mainstream, but let's just say it was more socially acceptable. Do you think that that would either make the movement grow, you know, like sports or whatever, you know, how
Look
popular
at
that is?
San Diego Comic-Con, for example.
Yeah.
Superheroes have now become mainstream in the last half decade.
Yeah.
Look at a lot of people who go to San Diego Comic-Con stop going because it no longer has the same feel as traditional comic conventions. In fact, most people now go to Balticon here in the Baltimore Convention Center because that keeps what a traditional Comic-Con is supposed to be.
Yep.
Yeah, so it just loses the base. For example, the largest Star Trek con, I think it's called Creation Con, it's now basically become like San Diego Comic-Con, where most Trekkies do not like to go to it. They said it's too corporate because there's lines for autographs. You have 1 second to talk to the voice actor or actor from the show, and then you have to move on. It's very, very corporatized. While at Shore Leave, you could go to the Hunt Valley Inn. You could sit in the bar with someone from the show and just have a nice casual conversation. That is something that you cannot get from a more corporatized professional con like Creation Con.
And some people say that BronyCon is heading that way, but I beg to differ. There are so many of the guests of honor that I just run into. They managed to dodge their handlers. They're in the Hilton bar, Marriott bar the past couple of years. They'll just hang out with people.
It's only
really interesting.
for you and some other people because we have 10,000 attendees for this con. They're not going to have the same small intimate feel as like we would say a Trot Con or Nightmare Nights.
Yeah, TrotCon.
But they have their place.
So
These
much
cons have their place. So
Absolutely.
I'm saying it's not a bad thing that BronyCon's like this because each of these cons have a specific purpose for why people go to them.
We're able to do big things because we actually have the budget to do so.
Right.
TrotCon can't.
Right, yeah, and that just kind of went to my other point is, I think it's because, you know, this demographic is so, you know, out of the norm. I think that, you know, the backlash from, you know, everyone else, you know, that's what made it grow. So I just was figuring maybe, you know, the movement wouldn't grow as much if it was more socially acceptable. You know, it would just kind of like fizzle away. But, you know, I just wanted to get your opinion.
That's,
so.
that's a good point. Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
definitely
next
agree.
question. Yeah, we'll try to move these along fast.
My
So.
question specifically related to science fiction conventions.
Right.
Now, have you heard of you know what the Hugo ceremony is?
The what
The
ceremony?
Hugos at WorldCon.
Yes, the Hugo Sports.
I just want a quick opinion on the pony episode ending up there because of the rabid puppy slate. You have any opinion? You have any opinions on that?
Oh, the sad puppies?
The rabid puppies.
The rabid puppies.
Box.
I know that.
It was on Equestria Daily, actually.
I
So,
didn't. Wow, I didn't know.
there was
they
a
were
post
on-
on Equestria
okay,
Daily
if
about
people
that.
don't know what they're talking about. Lately the awards for the Hugo ceremonies have been awarded to, you would say, more liberal, left-wing, progressive type stories. So it's no longer based on. It's no longer the stories are no longer based on like. People would say it's no longer based on an original story, but it's based off like
Politics.
politics. They want to do it because it's a black author is doing this, a female author is doing this. Let's vote them in. So you have a bunch of more right-wing conservative authors who write mostly military SF, and they were saying, why don't we ever get nominated for these Hugo Awards or Nebula Awards? Why doesn't this happen? And so they tried to create a conservative right-wing voting bloc.
Slate.
To at least vote in one conservative work for each category. But
Or in this year's case, 60 of some of the 80 possible entries.
all right. And I would say for award show, I tried to run one at BabsCon, a My Little Pony award show, but it didn't really go wrong well, so it's not going to work in the fandom. But okay, let's
Yeah,
move
it
it
really
along.
wouldn't
Sorry
work,
about
yeah.
that. We have like 2 minutes left, so we're going to try to get through these.
I'll try to keep this short and sweet. There were 2 other types of conventions that were not mentioned in your hierarchy, and I was wondering where they belong. One's NostalgiaCon, one's HorrorCons.
Wait, which one?
NostalgiaCon?
Nostalgia.
Nostalgia, I would say fall in franchises, and then horror cons would fall into genres.
Okay.
So I said literary genre cons, I would say horror cons fall into that category as well.
Yeah. I had a chance to meet Ray Harryhausen at one of them. He was a fantastic guy.
They're really good.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
I guess I'm the
we have
last
one more
person.
question? All right. Yep. Oh, no, because we're running out of time, that's why. Sorry.
I'm Terry Lee 007 on Twitter. So I just wish there was more, and I've been trying to do cross-pollination between science fiction fandom and brony fandom, because it seems like for BronyCon, which I love, it keeps reinventing the wheel. And so much of this has been done in science fiction conventions, but one of the things that I think makes BronyCon unique, that we have the benefit, the first science fiction convention started in '39, all male until the 1960s. No women allowed. So when you think about science fiction fandom, it's just kind of amazing how open and inclusive we are.
There's actually an interesting observation I made within the Brony fandom. A lot of the original I would say at least half of the founders of Brony conventions were actually all trans women.
Yeah.
Which I think was very interesting.
It's awesome. So I just wanted to mention that, and also one of the DC conventions was left off is Capclave, and I
Yes.
have brochures, I have cards. So
Capclave is
please,
awesome.
October, please come. It is not media, television media, but everyone is welcome.
Thank you very much.
I think it's actually interesting too that you mentioned about the trans women with BronyCon. The past couple of years, almost like 75% of all of the leading managers of BronyCon have been part of the LGBT community as well. So I think it's really interesting that we are able to be
Inclusive, that way.
as inclusive as possible.
Despite people thinking
gender
bronies are the
neutral
male thing.
bathrooms. I mean, in a convention in a city like this, it's amazing.
Right.
People love it.
Well, I think that our time is up. If you liked hearing what I have to talk about more in depth, make sure to check out my transformative art panel at midnight tonight in the building, the room right next door. And I want to thank you for coming and hope you enjoy BronyCon Year 5.
All views expressed in this panel do not reflect BronyCon.
Right. Thank you for coming.
Not a problem.